China moved to block the South China Sea, while America was watching Iran. That is the central fact. On April 10 and 11, 2026, satellite imagery later published on April 15 confirmed that Beijing deployed a floating barrier and naval vessels to block the entrance to Scarborough Shoal. This was not ambiguous. It was a physical obstruction placed at the entry point of a disputed maritime feature. The timing is not incidental. Diplomats have stated clearly that the move was calibrated to coincide with the perception that the United States is strategically and militarily distracted by its ongoing war effort related to Iran and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Before I go further, I want to know where you are watching this from and what your structural reading of this is. Put it in the comments, and stay until the end, because the data point I share in the final report changes how this entire report reads. Let me be precise about this. Scarborough Shoal is not just another contested reef. Under the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling, it is recognized as Philippine territory. Beijing has never accepted that ruling. That is the legal baseline. So when a barrier is placed at the entrance of that shoal, we are not looking at a routine patrol or a symbolic presence. We are looking at a direct physical denial of access in a location that international law has already adjudicated, even if one party rejects that adjudication. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The immediate framing, particularly in Western media, is that this is opportunistic aggression, that Beijing saw a distracted Washington and decided to act. There is truth in the timing. But timing alone does not explain the decision. To understand why this happened on these specific dates, you have to understand the structural environment that made such a move both possible and, from Beijing's perspective, rational. Today's visibility is yesterday's preparation. Consider the geography here. Scarborough Shoal sits roughly 120 nautical miles from where thousands of United States and Philippine troops are currently conducting joint military exercises. That distance matters. It is close enough to create immediate operational relevance, but far enough to remain outside the immediate perimeter of those exercises. This creates a narrow zone where signaling can occur without immediate direct confrontation, unless miscalculation intervenes. Now place that within the broader timeline. On February 28th, the United States launched what is described here as an unauthorized war related to Iran, focusing significant military attention and assets on securing the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a marginal commitment. It is a concentration of naval, logistical, and political capital in a different theater entirely. The South China Sea does not disappear in that moment, but the distribution of attention changes. There is no vacuum in strategy, only shifts in focus. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. The presence of joint US-Philippine exercises at the same time as this blockade introduces a second layer of structural risk. You have allied forces training in proximity to a newly imposed physical barrier at a disputed maritime location. That creates overlapping operational spaces. It also creates multiple audiences for the same action. Beijing is not only signaling to Manila, it is also signaling to Washington. And critically, it is signaling to every other state in the region watching how treaty commitments translate into behavior under pressure. A signal has three audiences. Most analysis only identifies one. Let me be very precise about this. This is not the first time Scarborough Shoal has been used as a testing ground for strategic signaling. The history here is essential. In 2012, a standoff at this same shoal resulted in China establishing de facto control after a withdrawal agreement that was not mutually honored. That event set a precedent. It demonstrated that control in this space can shift not through formal declarations, but through sustained presence and incremental action. This is not new behavior, it is consistent behavior under changing conditions. Now add the legal dimension back into the picture. The 2016 arbitration ruling invalidated China's expansive claims in the South China Sea, including its position on Scarborough Shoal. Beijing rejected the ruling outright. From a Western legal perspective, the current blockade is a violation of international law. From Beijing's perspective, the ruling itself lacks legitimacy. That divergence is not a detail. It is the core of the dispute. Miscalculation begins when legality and legitimacy diverge. So, when we say that China has blocked the shoal, we are describing an action that has two simultaneous interpretations. One is legalistic, a violation of an international ruling. The other is sovereign, an enforcement of what Beijing considers its own territorial claim. Both interpretations are internally coherent. Both lead to different expectations about what happens next. And this is where the structural pressure begins to build. At the same time, the Philippines is not acting alone. It is a treaty ally of the United States. That treaty carries expectations, not only in Manila but across the region. When a physical barrier is placed at a location recognized as Philippine territory, the question is not only what the Philippines will do. The question is what the United States is willing and able to do at that specific moment, given its commitments elsewhere. Commitments are tested at the point of inconvenience, not at the point of declaration. And here is the analytical question that emerges from all of this. What happens when a contested maritime action, a disputed legal framework, a treaty alliance, and a globally stretched military posture all intersect at the same location, at the same time? Because that is what we are looking at here. Not an isolated incident, not a spontaneous escalation, but a convergence of structural conditions that were visible and, importantly, predictable. Strategy is always clearer in the archive than in the moment. The context is now established. The facts are not in dispute. The timing is not accidental. The location is not incidental. The legal framework is contested. The military environment is active. The alliances are engaged. Think carefully about what that means.
To understand why Beijing made this decision, you have to understand the context in which it evaluates risk, timing, and signaling. This is not a reactive system. It is a system that studies patterns, waits for alignment, and then acts within what it calculates to be a controlled window. Let me be precise about this. The deployment of a floating barrier and naval vessels at Scarborough Shoal on April 10 and 11 was not an isolated operational move. It was the execution of a layered calculation. That calculation begins with sovereignty, extends to deterrence, and is shaped by the external behavior of the United States. From Beijing's perspective, Scarborough Shoal is not a secondary issue. It is part of what it considers core territorial integrity. The 2016 arbitration ruling does not alter that internal position because Beijing does not accept the legitimacy of that ruling. So when access to the shoal is physically restricted, the action is understood internally as enforcement, not escalation. Sovereignty disputes do not disappear. They wait for leverage. Now consider the timing. Diplomats have stated explicitly that this move is linked to the perception that the United States is distracted by its war effort related to Iran and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. This is not speculation. It is a stated interpretation from within the diplomatic community. The implication is clear. Beijing assessed that Washington's attention, assets, and decision-making bandwidth were concentrated elsewhere. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The assumption is that distraction creates opportunity in a simplistic sense. That is incomplete. What matters is not distraction alone, but the distribution of credible response capacity. The United States remains militarily capable in multiple theaters, but capability is not the same as willingness to escalate in two regions simultaneously. That distinction is central to Beijing's calculation. Capability signals strength. Allocation signals priority. Now shift to Washington's perspective. The United States has a treaty alliance with the Philippines. That treaty creates an expectation of support in the event of external pressure. At the same time, Washington is engaged in an active military operation related to Iran, focusing on securing a critical global choke point in the Strait of Hormuz. This creates a dual theater posture. Washington reads the Scarborough Shoal blockade as coercion, as a test of alliance credibility, as an attempt to change facts on the water while attention is elsewhere. That reading follows its internal logic. Beijing reads the same action as deterrence, as reinforcement of a standing claim, as a signal that external military presence in nearby waters will not translate into uncontested access. That reading also follows its internal logic. Both sides are correct about what they see, neither is correct about what the other sees. And this is the structural problem, not a personality problem. We have seen this exact dynamic before. In 2012, at this same shoal, a standoff resulted in a shift in control without formal escalation. The lesson drawn in Beijing was that persistence and timing can produce outcomes without crossing thresholds that trigger direct conflict. The lesson drawn in Washington was that ambiguity can create space for de-escalation. These lessons are not compatible. History does not repeat, the structural conditions do. Now add the Philippines into this equation. Manila operates within a narrower margin. It has a legal victory from 2016. It has a security guarantee from its alliance with the United States. But it does not have the same level of independent military capacity to enforce access at Scarborough Shoal. That creates reliance, and reliance introduces uncertainty when the guarantor is engaged elsewhere. A treaty is strongest when it is not being tested, and this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. At roughly the same time as this blockade, thousands of US and Philippine troops are conducting joint exercises 120 nautical miles from the shoal. That is not coincidence. These exercises are designed to demonstrate interoperability, readiness, and alliance cohesion. But their proximity to the blockade introduces a second layer of signaling. From Washington's perspective, the exercises reinforce commitment. From Beijing's perspective, they reinforce encirclement. From Manila's perspective, they reinforce dependence. A single action can reassure allies and alarm adversaries simultaneously. Now we come to the data point that changes the structural picture entirely. The blockade is not occurring in isolation from military presence.
It is occurring in parallel with active Allied exercises within operational proximity. This creates a compressed decision environment. Any movement by a Philippine vessel, by a Chinese patrol, by a US naval asset now carries increased risk of direct interaction. And this is where miscalculation becomes structurally more likely. Miscalculation requires no malice, only two different definitions of acceptable risk. Let me be very precise about this. Beijing is not seeking direct confrontation with the United States at this moment. The evidence does not support that conclusion. The placement of a floating barrier is a controlled, reversible action. It signals intent without immediately triggering irreversible escalation. Washington is also not seeking direct confrontation in this location at this moment.
Its primary military focus is elsewhere, but it cannot ignore an action that affects its treaty ally in a legally recognized maritime area. So both sides are operating under constraints. Both are signaling within those constraints, and both are interpreting the other signals through their own frameworks. Signals are clear to the sender, ambiguous to the receiver. This is not a situation where one side is acting irrationally. It is a situation where both sides are acting rationally within systems that are not aligned. Think carefully about what that means. The structure now contains all the elements required for escalation without intent: contested sovereignty, conflicting legal interpretations, alliance commitments, military proximity, and divided strategic attention. The question is no longer why this happened. The question is what this configuration produces next, if it remains unchanged. The structure now contains all the necessary conditions for a confrontation that neither side is actively seeking, but neither side is structurally positioned to avoid. That is the central conclusion. Not intention, not rhetoric, structure. Let me be precise about this. On April 10 and 11, a physical barrier was placed at Scarborough Shoal. That action sits on top of an unresolved sovereignty dispute, a rejected legal ruling from 2016, an active military alliance, and a simultaneous US military engagement in another critical region. None of these elements are new individually. What is new is their alignment in time and space. When variables align, outcomes accelerate. This is not what most people think it is. The dominant narrative is that this is a test, that Beijing is probing Washington's resolve while it is distracted. There is truth in that framing, but it is incomplete. What we are actually observing is the system behaving according to its internal pressures. Each actor is responding to incentives and constraints that have been building for years. Events feel sudden, structures build slowly. Consider the longer arc. The South China Sea has been a site of overlapping claims for decades. The 2016 arbitration ruling attempted to introduce legal clarity. Beijing rejected it. That rejection did not resolve the dispute. It froze it in a state where law and enforcement diverged. From that point forward, control would be determined less by legal argument and more by presence and capability. At the same time, the United States maintained its alliance commitments in the region while increasing its military presence through exercises and patrols. These actions were designed to reassure allies and maintain access, but they also reinforced Beijing's perception of strategic pressure along its maritime periphery. Presence stabilizes one side, it pressures the other. Now, introduce the February 28 decision by the United States to engage in a war effort related to Iran and to secure the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a peripheral operation. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical energy choke points in the world. Securing it requires sustained naval deployment, logistical support, and political focus. One theater does not disappear when another becomes active. But priorities are revealed through allocation. That is what Beijing is reading. Not absence, but distribution. Attention is finite. Strategy is the management of that limit. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. It is tempting to interpret the Scarborough Shoal blockade as a discrete escalation that can be reversed through diplomatic pressure or limited military signaling. The evidence does not support that level of simplicity. The action is embedded in a pattern that has been consistent. Incremental assertion, calibrated to avoid immediate conflict, but cumulative in its effect on control. Incremental change is the most durable form of change. Now return to the present configuration. Thousands of US and Philippine troops are conducting exercises 120 nautical miles from the shoal. A floating barrier blocks entry at the shoal itself. Naval vessels are present. A legal ruling exists but is not mutually recognized. A treaty alliance is in place. And the United States is simultaneously engaged in another theater that demands sustained attention. This is not a static picture. It is a dynamic system under pressure. A system under pressure does not require intent to produce escalation. Let me be very precise about this.
The risk here is not that one side suddenly decides to initiate a large-scale confrontation. The risk is that routine actions, a patrol, an attempt to access the shoal, a maneuver during exercises, are interpreted through incompatible frameworks at a moment when response options are constrained. Washington calls this coercion. Beijing calls this enforcement. Manila calls this a violation of its rights under international law. Each of these positions is internally consistent. None of them align. Alignment of logic is not required for collision. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. The presence of a treaty alliance introduces a second-order effect. The Philippines is not only responding to China, it is also observing the United States. Every action taken, or not taken, is read as a signal of what the alliance means in practice under strain. This observation is not limited to Manila. It is being watched across the region. Alliances are judged by behavior under pressure, not by text on paper. At the same time, Beijing is not only signaling to the Philippines, it is signaling to Washington and to the broader region. The message is not delivered through words, it is delivered through controlled actions that establish presence without crossing thresholds that would guarantee escalation. This creates a layered signaling environment where each move has multiple audiences and multiple interpretations. A signal that reaches many audiences is rarely understood the same way by any of them. Now step back from the immediate moment. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. The rejection of the 2016 ruling by Beijing, the reliance on that ruling by Manila, the maintenance of alliance commitments by Washington, the expansion of military presence in the region, and the decision by the United States to engage heavily in another theater beginning on February 28th. Each of these decisions followed its own logic. Together, they produced the current configuration. Structural forces do not require bad intentions to produce bad outcomes. So what does the evidence show? It shows that the South China Sea is no longer a peripheral issue that can be managed through routine signaling. It is a central arena where legal claims, military presence, and alliance commitments intersect under conditions of divided strategic attention. It shows that actions like the April 10-11 blockade are not isolated. They are part of a pattern of calibrated moves designed to shift control without triggering direct conflict. And it shows that the margin for error is narrowing. Think carefully about what that means. Because when structure, timing, and proximity align in this way, the outcome is not determined by what any single actor intends. It is determined by how the system processes the next interaction. Outcomes are produced by systems, not by statements.